February 2021. A massive winter storm named Uri sweeps across the southern United States. Texas, a state that had not seen temperatures like this in over 70 years, goes dark. The power grid collapses. Millions of pipes freeze solid, then burst. Families who have never prepared for cold weather find themselves without running water for days, sometimes weeks. Grocery stores run out of bottled water. People melt snow in their kitchens to flush their toilets. When the pipes finally thaw and the water comes back on, weeks later for some, something unexpected appears inside the homes that had been closed up and damp through the entire disaster. Bathtubs, sinks, and tile floors covered in thick brownish-yellow crust. A concentrated mineral buildup that would have taken years to form under normal conditions was now staring residents in the face in a matter of days, cemented onto surfaces by weeks of drip, evaporate, repeat. People scrubbed, they poured bleach, they tried every spray under the kitchen sink. Nothing worked. Calls to professional restoration companies skyrocketed. Quotes of $300, $500, sometimes over $1,000 landed in inboxes across the state, and still the yellow remained. But scattered across that same storm-battered region, there were homeowners who handled the entire problem in under 30 minutes for less than $2, using a powder that has existed since 1882, a powder that professional refinishers use themselves before they charge you $600 for a cosmetic paint job. Today on Historia Prime, we are going to uncover that powder. We are going to trace it back to its origins in the laboratories of 18th century Europe and the saloons of post-Civil War Indianapolis. We are going to understand exactly why it works when everything else fails, and we are going to teach you a practical, chemical survival skill that will save you real money starting this weekend. Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Part 1. The invisible enemy in your pipes. To understand the cure, we first need to understand the enemy. Why did your bathtub turn yellow? And why has everything you have tried, every spray, every scrubber, every magic foam, failed to make any difference? The answer begins underground. According to the United States Geological Survey, approximately 85% of homes in the United States have hard water, water that has traveled through ancient rock formations and dissolved significant amounts of calcium, magnesium, and iron along the way. This is not a modern problem. Our ancestors knew their water sources intimately. They built settlements around specific springs and rivers, not just for proximity, but because they had learned, the hard way, that different water sources had wildly different effects on their cooking, their health, and their homes. When hard water flows into your bathtub, sits, and then evaporates, and it does every single day, the water molecules disappear into the air. But the minerals don't go anywhere. They stay behind, pressed against the surface of your tub. Layer after invisible layer, day after day, month after month, they accumulate. They don't just sit on top of the porcelain. Over time, they bond with it chemically, fusing into the surface at a molecular level. That yellow-brown stain is not dirt. It is not soap scum. It is not evidence that you don't clean your bathroom. It is dissolved stone, calcium and iron deposits that have been fused to your bathtub by nothing more than time and evaporation. And that distinction changes everything about how you fight it. Part 2. The Great Chemistry Mismatch. Open your bathroom cabinet right now, or just picture it. How many products are in there? Bleach, vinegar spray, foaming bathroom cleaners, brand-name scrubs with bright labels and bold promises. You bought them because the packaging told you they were designed for the bathroom. Here is the thing nobody on that label explains to you. Every one of those products is designed to attack organic stains. Bleach kills mold, an organic living organism. Vinegar breaks down soap film, an organic residue left by your body's oils mixing with soap. Baking soda scrubs away organic buildup from skin cells and shampoo. But mineral deposits are inorganic. Using bleach on a hard water stain is like trying to melt granite with dish soap. You are sending the wrong chemistry into a battle it was never designed to win. You could scrub for 3 hours and the stain would laugh at you, because the chemistry is fundamentally mismatched. This is not a conspiracy. This is not a coordinated silence. It is something more mundane and arguably more frustrating. The general-purpose cleaning product market has no financial incentive to educate you about this distinction. A bottle of multi-surface cleaner sells whether or not it works on your specific stain. There is no patent on the specific compound that dissolves mineral deposits. It is a naturally occurring acid found in plants. No company holds exclusive rights to it. No corporation built a recurring revenue model around it. So no corporation funds the commercials that teach you to reach for it. You cannot patent a molecule found in rhubarb, and that simple fact explains everything. Part 3. The alchemist who found the answer in a dirty pot. To find the right weapon, we need to travel back to 18th century Europe. In the 1770s, a Swedish-German chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele was doing something that looks almost quaint by modern standards. He was systematically isolating and identifying compounds from common plants, minerals, and natural materials. Scheele was one of the most productive chemists of his era. He identified chlorine. He was the first to isolate manganese and oxygen, though he never got credit for oxygen because he published too late. The man was a discovery machine. Among his many investigations, Scheele isolated a compound found abundantly in spinach, rhubarb, and wood sorrel, a naturally occurring acid that he named oxalic acid. It was a laboratory curiosity for decades. Scientists noted it, filed it away, and moved on. Fast forward about a century. The year is 1882. America is in the middle of the Gilded Age. Cities booming, industry expanding, saloons on every corner of every growing town. In Indianapolis, Indiana, a chemist named George William Hoffman is cooking rhubarb in a tarnished, beaten-up old pot. When he lifts the rhubarb out, he notices something that stops him cold. The inside of the pot, which had been dark and tarnished for years, is gleaming. Clean, almost new-looking. Hoffman is a chemist. He knows what he is looking at. The oxalic acid naturally present in the rhubarb had dissolved the tarnish, the metallic oxidation and mineral buildup, right off the surface of the metal. Not scrubbed it, dissolved it. He spent the next several months developing a cleaning powder built around oxalic acid as its primary active ingredient. He began selling it to the tavern owners of Indianapolis, who used it to keep their brass bar rails and copper fixtures sparkling. The results were so dramatic that bartenders started calling it by a nickname that reflected exactly what it did for their business. They called it Barkeeper's Friend. The powder has been in continuous production ever since, one of the longest-running cleaning formulations in American commercial history, essentially unchanged in its core chemistry since 1882. The story of its origin is not buried. It is right there on the company's own website. A chemist, a tarnished pot, and a plate of rhubarb. Part 4. Why you have never heard of it. If this powder has existed since 1882, if it is still manufactured and sitting on hardware store shelves right now, why have most homeowners never heard of it? Why are bathtub restoration companies still charging $500 to fix a problem that costs $2 to solve? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is market incentives, and they are just as powerful. In the post-World War II housing boom, America built tens of millions of new homes. With those homes came a new service economy. Bathtub reglazing and refinishing became a viable trade. Professionals who could restore worn porcelain without replacing the tub entirely. And this is a legitimate service for certain situations. A tub that is cracked, chipped, or structurally worn does need professional intervention. But somewhere along the way, the industry expanded its territory. Today, according to industry data, professional bathtub reglazing runs anywhere from $300 to over $600, depending on your region. What many homeowners do not realize, and what no refinishing company advertises, is that before a technician sprays on the new coating, they almost always clean the surface first with an acid solution. Sometimes that solution contains oxalic acid or a similar mineral-dissolving compound. They dissolve the stain. Then they coat the now clean porcelain with epoxy or urethane. And then they hand you the invoice. The coating itself typically lasts 3 to 5 years before it begins to peel and chip. When that happens, you call them again. Over 20 years, that is potentially multiple reglazings and thousands of dollars for a stain that an afternoon and $2 could have eliminated in the first place. The powder did not get buried. It never had a marketing budget. There is no corporation whose profits depend on you buying it. It sits on the shelf at your local hardware store, labeled sometimes as oxalic acid, sometimes as wood bleach, sometimes as deck cleaner. It has been there for decades. It just never had anyone spending money to tell you it was there. Part 5. The chemistry that actually works. So why does oxalic acid succeed where bleach and scrubbing fail? The answer is elegant, and once you understand it, you will never approach a mineral stain the same way again. Hard water stains are made of calcium carbonate, iron oxides, and magnesium compounds, all alkaline or metallic mineral deposits. Oxalic acid is, as the name suggests, an acid. When it comes into contact with these mineral compounds, it reacts with them chemically, breaking the ionic bonds that hold them to the surface of the tub. The minerals are converted into water-soluble oxalate compounds, and soluble means they rinse away with water. The stain does not get scrubbed off. It does not get bleached into a lighter color. It is chemically converted from a solid, surface-bonded deposit into a dissolved liquid that you simply rinse down the drain. This is why you need almost no physical effort. The chemistry is doing 100% of the work. A soft sponge and running water are all that is required after the acid has done its job. There is a profound lesson here that goes beyond bathtub cleaning. Our ancestors who practiced traditional crafts, metalworkers, tanners, winemakers, dyers, understood at an intuitive level that different types of problems require fundamentally different types of solutions. A blacksmith knew that rust was not dirt. A tanner knew that mineral-tanned leather required completely different treatment than vegetable-tanned leather. This categorization of problems, organic versus inorganic, acidic versus alkaline, soluble versus insoluble, was practical survival knowledge, passed down through apprenticeships and craft traditions for centuries. We lost much of that granular applied chemistry when industrial products promised to handle everything in one convenient spray bottle. The most expensive piece of ignorance in the modern bathroom is not knowing the difference between what bleach can attack and what only acid can dissolve. Part 6. Know your tub before you begin. Before we get to the exact protocol, you need one piece of critical information. What is your bathtub made of? If your home was built before roughly 1980, there is a strong chance your tub is cast iron or steel coated with porcelain enamel. Porcelain enamel is essentially a layer of glass, a non-porous, extremely durable material, fused to the metal base at extremely high temperatures. Because it is glass, it is highly resistant to acids. Oxalic acid will dissolve mineral stains from porcelain enamel without damaging the surface at all. If your home is newer, or if your tub feels lighter and slightly warm to the touch, almost like plastic, you likely have an acrylic or fiberglass tub. These are softer synthetic materials. Mild concentrations of oxalic acid can still work on them, but a highly concentrated paste left for too long can potentially etch or dull the surface. Here is a fast field test. Grab a refrigerator magnet. Hold it against the side of your bathtub. If it sticks, you have a steel or cast iron base with porcelain enamel. You are clear to use the full-strength protocol below. If it doesn't stick, you likely have acrylic or fiberglass. In that case, dilute your solution more heavily, use a shorter contact time, 5 to 10 minutes instead of 20, and test a small hidden corner first. For fiberglass specifically, it is worth noting that Barkeeper's Friend's own formulation lists fiberglass as an approved surface. The pre-mixed commercial product has calibrated concentrations for this reason. If your tub is fiberglass, starting with the commercial product rather than raw oxalic acid powder is a sensible precaution. Part 7. The Restoration Protocol. Here is exactly what you need, no contractor required. Step 1. Source your material. Go to any hardware store and look for oxalic acid powder. It is sometimes labeled as wood bleach or deck cleaner. A 1-pound container costs between $1 and $3 and will clean your bathroom multiple times over. Alternatively, Barkeeper's Friend powder, which contains oxalic acid along with a mild feldspar abrasive, is available at most grocery and hardware stores for under $4. Step 2. Safety first, and I mean this seriously. Oxalic acid is an irritant. It can cause skin and eye irritation with direct contact, and it is toxic if ingested. Put on rubber gloves, open a window or run your exhaust fan. Keep children and pets out of the room until the treatment is complete and the tub has been thoroughly rinsed. These precautions take 30 seconds and make the whole process safe. Step 3. Prepare your paste. Mix 2 tablespoons of the oxalic acid powder with just enough warm water to form a thick paste, the consistency of toothpaste or thick frosting. You want it thick enough to cling to vertical surfaces without running. Step 4. Apply the paste to your completely dry bathtub. Use a soft sponge, never an abrasive scrubber, and spread the paste over every stained area. Pay particular attention to the corners, the drain ring, and the waterline, where mineral deposits are typically thickest. Step 5. Set a timer for 20 minutes. Leave the room, let the chemistry work. Step 6. When the timer goes off, return with your soft sponge and gently wipe the treated surface. The yellow residue will come away with almost no pressure. The contrast between treated and untreated areas will be immediately visible. It looks like 2 different tubs in one frame. Step 7. Rinse thoroughly with clean water from your shower head. Make sure every trace of powder is gone from the surface and from any drain strainers. Step 8. Critical. Neutralize the acid. Mix a simple solution of water and baking soda and wipe the entire tub surface. Baking soda is alkaline. It chemically neutralizes any remaining acid traces. Rinse once more with clean water. This step protects your porcelain and ensures no acid residue lingers. Total active working time, under 30 minutes. Total cost, under $3. Part 8. Keeping it white, the long game. You have just removed a mineral deposit that has been chemically bonded to your bathtub, possibly for years. But your water supply has not changed. Without a protective layer on the porcelain, the evaporation cycle will begin again, and the deposits will gradually return. The solution is a surface sealant, specifically a hydrophobic ceramic spray designed for bathroom surfaces, typically priced between $3 and $8 at any hardware store. These products use silicon dioxide, the same basic compound as glass, to create a microscopically thin, hydrophobic coating on the porcelain surface. Hydrophobic means water-repelling. When hard water hits a hydrophobic surface, it beads up and rolls off rather than spreading and pooling. No pooling means no evaporation. No evaporation means no mineral deposit. Apply the sealant to your freshly cleaned, completely dry tub according to the bottle instructions. Most take 15 to 30 minutes to cure. A single application typically lasts anywhere from 3 to 6 months under regular use. Reapplication takes 5 minutes and costs about $1 worth of product. The total long-term economics: $3 for the initial clean, $1 every few months for maintenance. Compare that to $500 to $600 for a professional reglazing that applies a cosmetic coating over the stain rather than removing it, a coating that will typically peel within 3 to 5 years of application. One note of honest calibration here: if your tub has chips, cracks, structural damage, or staining from chemical damage rather than mineral buildup, professional reglazing may be the appropriate choice. A skilled refinisher can repair surface damage that chemistry alone cannot address. This protocol is specifically for mineral and hard water staining, which represents the vast majority of household bathtub discoloration, not structural damage. Conclusion: the knowledge that was always there. Let's go back to February 2021 for a moment. The storm is over. The water is running again. Families across Texas are staring at stained, crusted tubs and wondering what to do. Some of them paid hundreds of dollars for a professional fix. Some of them are still living with the stain today. And some of them, the ones who happen to know what George William Hoffman discovered in his kitchen in 1882, went to the hardware store, spent $2, and had a white tub again before dinner. The knowledge was never buried. It was never suppressed. It has been sitting on hardware store shelves since before most of us were born. It simply never had a marketing budget, because you cannot build a subscription revenue model around a naturally occurring acid found in rhubarb. What we lose when practical knowledge like this disappears from everyday life is not just money, though the money adds up fast. We lose the ability to understand why things work. We lose the framework that lets us look at a problem, categorize it correctly. Is this organic or inorganic? Acidic or alkaline? Structural or superficial? And reach for the right solution instead of the most advertised one. Our ancestors who built things by hand, who maintained their own homes with materials they could source and understand, carried this framework as a matter of survival. They could not afford to be wrong. A farmer who treated the wrong disease in his soil, a blacksmith who used the wrong acid on the wrong metal, a ship's carpenter who chose the wrong wood preservative. Mistakes had real consequences. That necessity produced genuine knowledge. Hard-won, tested, passed down. We have access to all of that knowledge. We are just rarely pointed toward it. So here is what I want you to take away from today. Not just the powder, though I genuinely hope you go buy some this week and test it on your own tub. I want you to take away the habit of asking why before you reach for the solution someone is selling you. What kind of problem is this really? What chemistry is actually at work here? What did people use before there was a plastic bottle with a bright label telling them what to buy? Those questions, applied consistently, will save you far more than the price of a bathtub restoration. If today's video gave you something useful, a skill, a story, a new way of thinking about the problems in your home, please hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me what your tub looked like before and after. I read every one. Stay curious, stay self-reliant. We'll see you next time right here on Historia Prime.